You've probably heard it many times. I'm certainly tired of hearing it, but people are always saying that running is bad for your knees. I'm Lindsay Parry from coachparry.com, and we are here to tell you that running is not bad for your knees. Let me hand over to Shona and she can unpack this a little bit more.
So we get this question often, is running bad for your knees? And I have a particular answer towards that. I really do believe, and a lot of what is written in the science is that running isn't bad for your knees. Doing nothing is bad for your knees. Obviously, if you're coming in with some sort of contraindication, we need to be very specific about how we do things and how we load you and how we build you up. Not just going to throw you into running a marathon. Of course, we want to have some sort of progressive overload. But if you're not doing anything, any kind of activity, that is going to be bad for your knees. And essentially, if you're doing running and running well and doing some strength training, you're going to be really looking after your knees and all your other joints and bones as well. As I mentioned, obviously there are some contraindications around this. So if you do struggle with things like osteoarthritis or arthritis in your knees, or if you've had a lot of surgery on your knees, we need to be very specific about this and make sure that we don't just throw you into the deep end, so to speak, around running. A lot of science and the literature at the moment speaks around that you need to start incorporating some strength training if you do struggle with things like osteoarthritis, because that strength training is going to be placing a load on the bones. So that's actually going to be helping the bones to maintain that little bit of strength that you have in there, and your decline in your bone strength isn't as severe. Therefore, you would then still be able to manage some of the running load as well. From a knees perspective with running, and if you do struggle with things like arthritis or osteoarthritis, we can adapt things slightly and perhaps take one of the running sessions away and incorporate a cross-training session on a bike or swimming, where you're still building your aerobic capacity, but not with that load of running. And it is an absolute non-negotiable that if you're a runner with osteoarthritis, that strength training forms a massive part of your training. We'll talk a little bit more about that strength training in just a little bit, but I want to hand over to Dev now, and he's going to talk a little bit more about what does cause damage in your knees while you are running.
So now that we know that running is safe, it's not bad for your knees, let's talk about just maybe one or two of the factors that can potentially lead to some problems here and there. The first one is the equipment you're using. I refer to equipment, I'm talking about your running shoes in particular in this case. The idea, regardless of who you are as a runner, all running shoes will have a lifespan. That is the amount of mileage you put into those running shoes. Now, that's going to be dependent on the surfaces you're running on, the event you're training for, how much mileage you've put into it, as well as your body size. Obviously, the heavier you are, the less mileage your shoes will generally get out of them. So that's one thing, is to make sure that your shoes are still in good condition to be getting all the supportive properties that they're supposed to be giving you in a run. I would generally suggest going to a specialist running store where they can have a look at the wear patterns on your shoes. They can see what kind of running you're doing, get you maybe on a treadmill, seeing your gait, how you wear a pair of shoes, and then make recommendations on what is optimal for you and the best fit. So that's the equipment side of things. Then more of a biomechanical and a structural aspect that we need to then be aware of is the potential of instability and weakness around any of our joints. In particular, our foot. So I know we're talking knee pain, but more often than not, that knee pain is actually a problem lower down or higher up in the chain of the leg. So when I talk about the feet, it could be weak muscles in the intrinsic muscles of the foot, which means your arches are collapsing every time you take a step or you try and push off. That leads to instability in the ankle might be rolling in, and all of that then causes a misalignment, and your knees then start to dive in or dive out and potentially higher up the chain, causing other damage. So that's most of the time where that knee pain comes in. And the recommendation here is then to put in steps to prevent that instability happening, and that's usually where we talk about strength training. And I'm going to hand over to Shona to dive into the strength aspect in a little bit more depth.
Cool, so let's dive into a little bit of how we can prevent these sort of knee injuries or knee concerns while we are running. Dev touched on a strength aspect and an imbalance perhaps in strength concerns, and that is really, really key, because your hamstring and your quads work together as agonist and antagonist. That's just a fancy way to say that they work in symbiosis when we're running. And so we want to make sure that we have a good relationship between our quads and our hamstrings. Essentially, if your quads are too strong for your weak hamstrings, you're going to find that you're getting knee issues, whether at the back or at the front of the knee. And so we want to make sure that that balance is correct. So strength training is really, really important here. That ratio between the quads and the hamstrings is key, and what I see very common in runners is actually it's not that it's a quad weakness, it's actually a weakness within their hamstrings. So their hamstrings are just far too weak for the strength of the quads, and I also really see a weakness in the glutes. And if your glutes are weak, and in particular in females, but very common in men as well, is that if your glutes are weak, you tend to have an internally rotated pelvis, so your pelvis rotates slightly inwards, and that then causes a little bit of that sort of knee valgus, what we call, or that bending at the knee, and that with repetition of running will then cause a little bit of strain and pain while you are running. So strengthening the glutes gets that pelvis sort of rotating or sort of rotating outwards. Strong pelvic control doesn't allow for this to sort of be going on as well with every step that you take. And that's going to help take a little bit of strain off the knees. Hamstring strength is really important. Again, just touching on that balance between the quads and the hamstrings, but it also contributes to every time you land, every time you have your foot strike in your run. If your hamstring is not strong enough, what essentially is going to happen is that there might just be a little bit of hyperextension at the knee because your hamstring is not strong enough to pull your leg back in time after your heel strike or your foot strike. And that is what's really going to place a lot of pressure, in particular on the posterior knee as well. One of the other things, so this is from a strength perspective, yes, we want to have good strength. You want to have a lot of good strength in the quads, and in particular where people struggle with patellofemoral pain or that pain that's on the kneecap in particular. The reason for that is that your kneecap is essentially, so if this is your knee, right over there, the femur and the lower bone, your kneecap sort of sits over that, and it's held in place by your quadricep, okay? And in particular, the three muscles of the quadricep. It gets broken into four, but the three muscles of the quadricep hold that patella in place. So you want to make sure that you have a good balance in strength on the outside of the quad and on the inside of the quad. And in most runners, that inside of the quad, that VMO we call it, is weaker, and that then causes that patella to slide across the bones. And that's really where you get a lot of that creaky, achy kind of pain, because with every step that you take, that patella is sliding. And what we want to do is make sure that those two quadricep muscles are holding that patella in place so the knee joint can just do its business behind the patella. So strength is really important, yes. But as I mentioned around the quadriceps and the hamstrings, is very often a lot of people have tight quads and weak hamstrings. And in particular, tight quads and tight hip flexors. And if your quads are very tight, it's also going to affect that sort of range of motion with every step that you take running. And so that's what people tend to do. They go, oh, I've got knee pain, let me strengthen my quads, and that just gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And so loosening up those quads a little bit of static stretching, some mobility, some physio if need be, to help loosen up the quads, in particular the structures in and around the patella, will really help. But then at the same time, you do want to strengthen, but try when you're strengthening the quads, if you do have tight quads, we don't want to do any sort of squat movements or any movements where you're loading on the front. So you don't want to do front squats or goblet squats or anything like that. You want to load in the posterior chain just to take a little bit of pressure off the knee. Those of you who have done some strength training with us before will know that we are sticklers for technique. And when you're doing your strength training, one of the things that we don't like to do is really be pushing your knees over your toes. That puts a lot of pressure on the knees because essentially your entire weight is now leaning over the knees, and that's what's causing a little bit of strain. But very often when you go through your day-to-day life, your knee does land up going over your toe. Think about when you're walking downstairs. You don't walk downstairs by squatting with your bum going back first and putting all the pressure on your heel. You very often put your foot down and your knee goes over your toe. So in order to be functional, we want to be able to be strong enough to have our knees going over our toes. But the way we train it is that we want to ensure that we are being safe and ensuring that we're building strength in the safest way possible.
So if you'd like a strength program, click on the link on screen now. If you got value and you liked this video, please click on the like and subscribe button now and check out any of the other videos that we have.